heavy airstrikes from Israel damaged areas near the defense ministry and the presidential palace. Israeli forces are pushing back after Syrian forces attacked Druze communities in southern Syria that share a border with the Golan Heights. Now, Syria's interim president Ahmad al-Shara addressed the nation and says protecting the Druze citizens is their priority.
So Syria is like filled with a bunch of minority groups. There's the Druze, not to be confused with the Jews, closed sect of Shia Muslims who basically they pass on their tradition through like, a certain groups of like exalted scholars. It's interesting. And they're concentrated, a lot of them in southern Syria. Now, Israel also happens to have a large Druze community, mostly because of the occupation of the Golan Heights. And you don't know about the Golan Heights, let me show you a fun little map. So the Golan Heights are here. I could get a bigger map. Okay, yeah. I don't know why this is focused on Israel, but you can see the Golan Heights are kind of at the bottom tip of Syria here, bordering Lebanon. And while they're not part of Israel's territorial boundaries, like not really recognized anywhere, Israel has been occupying this space for about 70 years now? I think since 1967. So a lot of Druze live here, and a lot of them are either, some of them are Israeli citizens, some of them are not Israeli citizens, and they kind of don't have citizenship. But, they're kind of, their community is kind of concentrated between Syria, Israel, and Lebanon. The previous government, like Bashar al-Assad, nominatively, they were secular, right? Like, the Assad government was focused on, like, ideologically, they were, like, pan-Arab and, not Muslim in character. They weren't really trying to represent any, like, particular group, supposedly. But they were largely composed of Alawites. And Alawites are another religious minority in Syria, another branch of Shia Islam. So there may be like a tenth of the country is Alawite, and then a lot of Syria is Sunni. Now that being said, Syrians don't always really talk about religion. It's not like a major factor in some of their lives. For a lot of Sunnis, at least, not a huge factor in some of their lives. But for a lot of Sunnis, it is. And this new president of Syria comes from a Sunni Islamist factions in Syria, who, basically like took over the country in like a surprise campaign earlier in December. So there's been a lot of tension between the new government of Syria and the local minorities, right? Because the new government obviously is descended from Sunni Islamist groups, and not a lot of people are fans of former Al-Qaeda groups, okay, me included. But the new government is really trying to focus on keeping Syria united, protecting its sovereignty. The problem is they just don't really have good control over the military, over what's happening on the ground. Like, as soon as the new president of Syria took over, he took all of these like Sunni Islamist, I don't love the term Islamism, but I'm using it just for the sake of like, ease of conversation. But a lot of Sunni militia groups, the new president of Syria formalized them, said, okay, I'm going to give you a formal rank and title. You're going to be put on the government's payroll, and you're part of the army now. And one of their big stated goals is to get a lot of the different militia groups in Syria, which include, these Sunni militias. They also include militias that are focused on smaller minority communities in Syria, like the Kurdish militias, and there's some Druze groups as well, and there's, Alawite or Assad loyalist factions as well. And the new government of Syria has basically been saying, please integrate into, one unified national armed forces of Syria so we can unify the country and like start rebuilding and whatever. That's all well and good, but the problem is that there are still a lot of attacks being led by Sunni militias against religious minorities in Syria. So for example, and part of it's, normal tensions you can expect in a country that has just come out of like a decade-long civil war that the new government is just not handling well. So earlier this year, there was an attack on Alawite groups on the coast of Syria who had, after like a small like group of people basically staged a protest saying like, we want Bashar al-Assad back, like we still believe in the old regime. The fact that the Bashar al-Assad government was largely composed of Alawites did like gain some benefits from having someone like them in a position of power. But when the new government of Syria, when Ahmed al-Shara saw the problem, saw this, these pro-Assad protests happening, he decided to send in the army, the Syrian army. The problem is that the Syrian army is just composed of a bunch of these Sunni militia groups, a lot of whom still have their own Telegram channels, are still communicating mostly with themselves. So he doesn't really have good control over them, and so he sends them in, and they're still operating on like ethnic-based assumptions of who's at fault. So instead of like focusing on de-escalating, protest uprisings, whatever, they just go in and like start attacking Alawites and killing Alawites in general, like whoever is there on the coast. And so we're seeing a similar thing happen with the Druze, where the new government is trying to impose order and trying to get the Druze to integrate their arms into the new national army, but they're basically asking the Druze to disarm completely, like lay down your weapons, give them to the state, you start joining the state. Meanwhile, the government is sending in Sunni militias that are basically just wreaking havoc and that the government does not have strong control over. The new government could try to crack down on these Sunni militia groups, but they're like it's the entire army basically. It's completely reliant on the Sunni militia groups to compose the army. So it's kind of a catch-22, where they really want all of the militia groups in Syria to integrate into the national army, and a lot of the minorities with militias that are defending the minorities are worried about that because they're, kind of under attack by factions within the army. So that's kind of what's going on there. Now, all of that is kind of an internal affair to Syria, right? Like it's internal, like obviously it's been fomented, like these ethnic tensions have been fomented and encouraged by like years of foreign intervention from the US, from Israel, from Russia, from Iran, from Turkey, basically sending floods of weapons into these groups and using them for their own aims. The US like sending weapons to the Kurds to try to prop them up and destabilize, the Syrian government and have a faction that will fight against ISIS there. Right. Okay, so there is a lot of foreign intervention in Syria. Still, like these groups, the issue of integrating, minorities into the army, whatever, it's really an internal affair to Syria. And I'm not going to tell you that there aren't minority groups in Syria who are begging for foreign intervention. Like I know some people who are Druze who, when they see the government try to send in the army to quell the unrest, they're like, please, somebody come in and stop this. But that's, it really doesn't help, because at least we haven't seen it be helpful so far, because it kind of exacerbates the tensions within Syria. Minorities start to align with outside like foreign powers because they're not really trusting the new Syrian government, and that kind of undermines the legitimacy of the Syrian government. And obviously the new Syrian government does not want that, right? As much as I don't trust Ahmed al-Shara, I don't trust Sunni militia groups, like at least at the upper level, they're not trying to fuck up the bag, right? For Syria, they don't want Syria to get cooked, because like anytime the Syrian government sends in the army and the army makes things worse, like that's just a bad look for the new Syrian government in general, not just in the eyes of the world and people are watching, but also internally, because Syrians really, really want to have an end to just the conflict that they've been seeing on and on for like over a decade now. And a lot of them are placing a lot of faith in the new government, but the more these sorts of, mistakes, quote unquote, happen, the more it looks like this project is going to fall apart and we're going to have a new phase of the civil war. So that's what That's what Syrians are really, I think, scared of overall. I think minority groups in Syria are scared that the government is not doing a good job at all of cracking down on groups within the army that are perpetrating, pretty violent attacks. But all that being said, that's me, as somebody who is Syrian, has Syrian relatives, whatever. This is my perspective on Syria's internal politics. None of that gives Israel the right or justification to come into Syria and impose its own will. So let's see if we can pull up Netanyahu. My brothers, the Druze citizens of Israel, the situation in Sueda in southwestern Syria is very serious. We're acting to save our Druze brothers and to eliminate the gangs of the regime. This is Netanyahu's formal, outside reason, like what he says to the public. This is his reason for going into Syria. Basically, the context to this is earlier this week there was conflict between some tribes in southern Syria and Druze citizens there, Jewish citizens of Syria, Druze Syrians. The army started to go in. Obviously, Druze minorities in Syria are a little bit worried about what the army is going to do. And then Israel's like, this seems like a good time to just like add ourselves into the fray. And they started airstriking like all over southern Syria. There are roughly 700,000 Druze in Syria. Another 150,000 Druze live in Israel. Blah, blah, blah. The Israeli Druze see themselves as Druze, as Israelis, and as Arabs. Yeah, there are some Israeli Druze who have been lobbying the Israeli government to go in and attack Syria. But the thing is, like, the Netanyahu government obviously does not give a fuck about the Druze, doesn't give a fuck about Syrians or protecting anybody. Since December, when the new government took over, Israel has been occupying like a huge swath of territory in southern Syria. Like, let's see if we can, and it's calling this the demilitarized zone. So yeah, so it's staging troops here in the phase 1 area. I'm not sure what phase 2 is all about. And then this is the capital of Syria, Damascus. So literally this is right next to the capital. But Israel is basically saying, we want all of this space to have no Syrian military troops stationed or entering whatsoever. Israeli troops are along the border here. Sueda is the name of this area. Like, troops from Damascus started coming into the zone that Israel said is demilitarized. And this is, within the right of the new Syrian government. Like, regardless of, what anybody thinks about the politics and the righteousness of the new Syrian government. And again, like I just said, there's plenty of room for criticism regarding how they're treating minorities. It is like, this is their sovereign territory. This is Syrian sovereign territory. It's not for Israel to say you can't bring troops into here. So, and it's actually a violation of sovereignty to, be telling Syrian government that you can't have any fucking troops in here. So, as soon as Syrian troops started entering, Israel's quote-unquote demilitarized zone, that's when Israel started attacking. So what this kind of goes to show is that Israel is really considering this swath of territory of southern Syria to be within its sphere of influence, within its control, and that it has the right, Israel thinks it has the right, Netanyahu thinks he has the right to attack and launch strikes based on what's happening in this territory, which suggests that he's trying to make this occupation of southern Syria permanent. Why? Why is there a genocide happening in Gaza? Why are they taking over, all of the West Bank after the Oslo Accords? Why did they occupy southern Lebanon last year? This is kind of the question of, Israel's entire foreign policy since Netanyahu came into power, but also since 1967, since 1948, since the creation of Israel. Like, are you going to be constantly expanding and taking over territory that, okay, at first maybe you can take over some, Palestinian territory that's not internationally recognized, whatever, but slowly, going after territory that is internationally recognized as belonging to other countries. All right, let's continue with.
It's very provocative, and it would be an escalation, except that cooler heads seem to be prevailing, not only on the U.S. side, but also on the Syrian side. But it's a hard calculation to make sure that no one feels like they're under Israeli airstrikes or they're not being respected by the government. So that's what's happening in Syria.
That was actually a very good breakdown because I understand it very clearly now, Courtney. Thank you for that.
That's my job.
Thank you. So, Courtney, sources tell CBS, sources tell CBS News that the Trump administration is cautiously optimistic that we could get a break.
One thing that bothers me so much about Western media is just like, they act like this shit is so fucking complicated. And it's like, yeah, when you invite white people to talk about shit that they have no fucking connection to, of course it's going to sound complicated, but like, just talk to people who are there, who know from experience. There's plenty of journalists who have been covering Syria and Israel from the perspectives of Syria and Israel. Like, not that fucking crazy, bro. Like, it's not, I just don't get why they're like laughing and giggling with each other like, oh my god, you did such a great job. Oh my god.